The strong winter wind blew loudly across the wide, flat lands of Wyoming in 1878. Margaret Wilson pulled her warm, wrapped tighter around her shoulders, while she poked the fire in her simple house. 3 years had gone by since she left the fancy city of Philadelphia. She traded the stuffy, rich life for the tough, free life of the wild lands. Out here, no one knew about the bad thing that made her run away, about the rich man she was supposed to marry, who left her when her family lost all their money. The small ranch she built with her savings was nothing like the big house she grew up in, but it was hers. 20 acres of land, a strong house, 4 horses, and enough cows to feed her. It wasn't a lot, but it was freedom. A sudden loud tap on the door surprised her. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially in winter. "Who's there?" Margaret called out, grabbing the special gun she kept by the door. No answer came. Only another, loud, desperate tap. Carefully, she opened the door a tiny bit, gun ready. But instead of someone trying to break in, she found nothing. Then, looking down, she saw a small bundle wrapped in an old blanket. "Oh my goodness," she whispered as the bundle moved, showing the face of a sleeping bubby, only a few months old. Margaret quickly looked into the dark outside her porch. Far away she saw a quick look of a person on a horse riding away into the night. Next to the baby lay a folded piece of paper. She grabbed it fast, finding a rough map with just one word written on it. "Run." Her hands shook as she brought the baby inside, closing and locking the door tightly behind her. The baby moved, its eyes opening to show surprising blue eyes that see Meadow look right through her. "Where did you come from, little one?" she whispered, holding the child close as if the baby answered. T-Bubby began to cry. It was a sound that both scared her and woke up something inside Margaret that she thought had died a long time ago. She unwrapped the blanket carefully, finding a small silver necklace tucked inside. Opening it, showed a tiny picture of a woman, with the same striking blue eyes as the child, and carved inside were the words, "Protect Rose." Margaret repeated softly, "Is that your name?" The baby became quiet at the sound, tiny fingers reaching up to grab Margaret's thumb with surprising strength. Margaret looked at the map again. It showed a path heading north, toward the Montana land. But why run? Who had left this child? And, more importantly, who might be looking for her? As the sun came up across the plains, Margaret made her, she couldn't leave this child. But staying put clearly wasn't a choice. Whatever danger was threatening this baby now threatened her too. She spent the day getting ready, packing supplies, getting her strongest horse ready, and sending a letter to her only friend in the area, the local shop owner Abigail, explaining Thatch needed to leave suddenly. As evening came, Margaret took one last look at the home she'd built. Then, with baby Rose safe against her chest and the special gun across her horse's saddle, she rode north into the growing darkness, leaving behind everything she'd worked for. The map in her pocket felt heavy, with promises not said and dangers not known, but one thing was clear. Margaret Wilson was no stranger. Starting fresh, the chase begins. 3 days into their trip, Margaret and baby Rose had gotten into a strange routine. They traveled at night when they could, resting during the day in any place they could find that gave shelter. Empty old houses, caves, or just under the big branches of cottonwood trees. Rose turned out to be a very quiet baby, almost as if she understood the need to be silent. Margaret had made a carrier that kept the baby safe against her chest, leaving her hands free for holding the horse's reins and, when needed, her gun. They were following the rough map northward, going around towns and small villages. Margaret had enough experience with life in the wildlands to hunt for food and find water. But supplies were running out faster than she thought. Soon they would need to risk visiting a trading post. It was near evening on the 4th day when Margaret first felt they were being followed. Her horse, Penny, had become restless, her ears flicking backward again and again. Margaret had learned to trust her animals' gut feelings. She turned off their path, finding a hidden spot among a group of big rocks. With Rose sleeping against her chest, Margaret waited, special gun ready. The sound of hooves getting closer proved her fears were right. 3 riders showed up in the distance, moving slowly, looking at the ground, tracking. One rider raised his hand, pointing to the tracks Margaret had left before she had realized they were being followed. Even from this far away, she could see something shiny on his chest. A badge. Police, she whispered to herself. But why would the police be after a baby? The men got off their horses, looking at the ground more carefully. The tallest one, a man with a special black hat and a long coat, seemed to be giving orders. Something about him made Margaret shiver. "We need to move, little one," she whispered to Rose, who moved, but stayed thankfully quiet. Margaret waited until the men had continued along her false trail, before carefully backing Penny deeper into finding a narrow passage that led away from the people chasing them. They would need to travel through the night now, putting as much space as possible between themselves and the men. By morning, they reached a small trading post. Little Morathan, a cabin with supplies for travelers and people who trapped animals. Margaret hesitated, knowing it was risky, but they needed food. The old owner, a man named Jenkins, with a wild grey beard and kind eyes, didn't ask questions when Margareted with Rose. He simply nodded at the baby and began gathering the supplies Margaret asked for. "Heading north?" he asked casually. "Yes," Margaret replied carefully. Jenkins nodded. "Folks came through yesterday asking about a woman traveling with a baby. Said she kidnapped the child." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I hadn't seen nobody," Jenkins said, looking into her eyes. Something didn't feel right about them. "One had a badge, but it didn't look real to my eyes. I've been out here 40 years, seen all kinds of men with all kinds of badges." "Thank you," Margaret said, feeling a wave of relief. Jenkins leaned closer. "They're headed to Fort Collins. If I were you, I'd go west before heading north again." As Margaret was ready to leave, Jenkins pressed a small package into her hands. "Extra milk powder for the little one. And this," he handed her a folded paper map of old paths used by animal trappers, not on any official maps. "Might help you avoid unwanted company." Margaret thanked him, wondering about the kindness of strangers in this harsh land. Back on the trail, Jenkins' map and compared it to the one left with Rose. They matched perfectly, as if they were two pieces off the same puzzle. The new map showed a path through the mountains that would eventually lead to a small place marked only as Haven. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret spotted a cloud of dust in the faraway ground behind them. The people chasing her had found out her trick and changed their direction. "Hold tight, Rose," she whispered, making Penny gallop toward the distant mountains. "We're about to find out how good those trapper trails really are." The mountain, safe place. The trapper paths turned out Tobe, both a good thing and a bad thing. They twisted through the small hills in confusing ways, going back and spitting often, making it almost impossible for anyone to follow without Jenkins' map. But they were also dangerous narrow paths, along steep drops, loose rocks that seemed like they would fall under Penny's hooves, and thick forests that blocked light. After 2 days in the mountains, Margaret was sure they had lost the people chasing them, but the trip had taken its toll. Rose had gotten a small fever, and Margaret's own strength was getting low from not enough sleep and constant watch. As the evening came on their 7th day of travel, they came out of a thick pine forest to find a small valley tucked between tall mountains. A thin puff of smoke rose from a cabin at the far end, next to a clear mountain stream. Margaret hesitated. The map showed this might be a safe place, a stopping point, marked with a simple X. But she had grown tired of trusting anyone. Rosa Swining made the choice for her. The baby needed warmth and good care. As they got close to the cabin, a tall person came out, gun in hand. Margaret became tense, reaching for her special gun. "That's Farah now," called a woman's voice, strong and clear. "I mean no harm." Margaret replied, "I'm traveling with a baby who needs shelter." The woman stepped forward, showing a face with lines from the sun and wind, framed by black hair with streaks of silver. She looked to be in her 50s, with the strong build of someone who had spent a lifetime in the mountains. "I'm Hattie Blackwood," the woman said, lowering her gun a little. "And you're on my property." "Margaret Wilson. And this is Rose." Margaret moved the bundle in her arms, showing the baby's red face. Hattie's face immediately softened. "That child has a fever. Bring her inside." The cabin was surprisingly big, and nicely set up inside. Animal furs lined the walls. A large stone fireplace was the main thing at one end, and shelves of books suggested Hattie was no ordinary mountain person. "You're running from something," Hattie stated as she made a herbal medicine for Rose's fever. It wasn't a question. Margaret hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Men are following us. They claim I kidnapped Rose, but she was left at my door with a map and a warning to run." Hattie nodded, not surprised. "Jenkins sent word you might be coming. He has ways of getting messages through these mountains faster than any rider. You know Jenkins. We've been helping people disappear for years," Hattie explained gently, giving the medicine to Rose. "Some running from the law, others from men who think they are the law." Margaret felt a heavy feeling lift from her shoulders, the first tiny bit of hope since finding Rose on her doorstep. "Who are they?" she asked. "The men following us." Hattie's face became dark. From Jenkins' description, he believed the leader is Marshal Hayes. He wears a badge, but he's no true police officer. He works for whoever pays him, usual Eric men who want problems to disappear. But why would anyone want a baby to disappear? "That," Hattie said, "is what we need to find out." She pointed to the silver necklace around Rose's neck. "May I?" Margaret nodded, and Hattie looked at the necklace carefully, her eyes widening at the picture inside. "This woman," she whispered, "I've seen her before." Hattie moved to a big box in the corner, taking out a folded newspaper. "She came through these parts about a year ago, causing quite a stir." The newspaper headline read, "Woman Fights Father's Mining Empire." Below was a picture of the woman from the necklace, named Victoria Horov, daughter of the rich copperman, Richard Horov. According to this, Hattie continued, she was looking into claims that her father's mines were built on land stolen from both settlers and native tribes through fake papers. She disappeared shortly after this was published. Margaret stared at the picture, then at baby Rose, seeing the clear likeness in those striking blue eyes. "You think Rose is Victoria Hargrove's daughter?" Hattie nodded sadly. "And if Richard Horov found out he had a grandchild who could possibly get his entire Simiday, a grandchild whose mother had threatened to destroy everything he built, he'd want to control the baby. Or worse," Margaret finished. "You can stay here until Rose gets better and you've rested," Hattie offered. "But you can't stay long. Hayes is known for his tracking skills, and he never gives up a hunt." That night, as Rose slept peacefully for the first time in days, Margaret looked at Jenkins' map by lamplight. The path led further north, eventually reaching the settlement, marked as Haven near the Canadian border. "It's a community of people who've started over," Hattie explained, joining Margaret at the table. "People with secrets, people who needed to disappear. They protect their own." "How do you know all this?" Margaret asked. Hattie's eyes looked far away. "I had a daughter once. She married a powerful man who turned out to be a monster. When she tried to leave with their child, he had her said to be crazy and put her in a hospital. The baby, my grandson, disappeared." Her voice became hard. "That's when I learned how powerful make people disappear. And I decided to help those they hunt." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing Hattie's hand. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Hattie replied. "Be ready. Hayes will be here within days. And when you reach Haven, find a man named Joseph Blue. Give him this." She pressed a small carved wooden token into Margaret's hand. "He'll know I sent you." Outside, the wind howled through the mountain paths, bringing with it the promise of an early snow. And somewhere in that darkness, Margaret knew Marshal Hayes was still hunting. Betrayal in the valley. 3 days passed at Hattie's cabin. Rose's fever broke, and Margaret got her strength back. Hattie taught her survival skills for the northern lands, how to read weather patterns, find plants you could eat, and move through the wild without leaving clear tracks. On the morning of the 4th day, they saw smoke signals rising from a faraway mountaintop. 3 short puffs, followed by 1 long trail. "Jenkins' warning system," Hattie explained sadly. "Hayes has entered the valley. You need to leave immediately." Margaret packed quickly, putting Rose safely in the carrier, while Hattie got Penny ready for the journey ahead. "Take the western pass," Hattie instructed, pointing to a barely visible trail that wound up the mountainside. "It's steeper, but Hayes won't expect you to go that way. It joins with the main trail again after 15 miles. As Margaret got on Penny, Hattie pressed a small handgun into her hand. "It's easier to handle than that Winchester when you're holding the baby." "I can't take your weapon," Margaret protested. "You can, and you will," Hattie replied firmly. "I have others, and you need every advantage." With a final hug, Margaret rode out, Rose safe against her chest end, the handgun tucked into her belt. The western trail was indeed steep, forcing her to get off the horse and lead Penny through the narrowest parts. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over Hattie's valley. What she saw made her blood run cold. 4 riders approached Hattie's cabin. Hayes and his men. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the shine of weapons in the sunlight. "God protect her," Margaret whispered, torn between continuing her escape and returning to help the woman who had shown them such kindness. The decision was made. For her, when Rose began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable from the journey, Margaret had to press on for Rose's sake. They traveled through the day and into the night, the trail eventually getting wider as it joined with the main path. Margaret pushed on, determined to put as much distance as possible between them and Hayes. Near dawn, they reached a small settlement. Little more than a trading post, a saloon, and a few cabins. The sign proclaimed it Silver Creek, though it was named for it had long since dried up. Margaret approached cautiously, desperate for supplies, but careful of strangers. The trading post was just opening. Its owner, a heavy-set man with a bushy mustache, sweeping the porch. "Morning, ma'am," he called as Margaret approached. "You're out early." "Just passing through," Margaret replied, getting off her horse carefully. "With Rose. Need some supplies, if you're open." The man introduced himself as Barton, and welcomed them inside. As Margaret selected things to buy, she casually asked about the path north. "Not many head that way this time of year," Barton commented. "Winter comes early up there." "I'm meeting my husband," Margaret lied smoothly. "He's setting up our new home." Barton seemed happy with this explanation, and continued helping her gather supplies. As she paid, Margaret noticed a wanted poster on the wall behind the counter. Her own face stared back at her, beneath the words, "Want kidnapping." She kept her face showing no emotion, thanked Barton, and left as calmly as she could manage. Once out of sight of the trading post, she made Penny gallop, heading north out of town. They had gone less than a mile when Margaret heard hooves behind her. Glancing back, she saw Barton riding hard in pursuit, a gun in his hands. "Stop right there," he shouted. "There's airwood for that baby." Margaret bent low over Penny's neck, urging the horse faster. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling past her ear. Rose began to cry, the sound making Margaret push Penny beyond what she thought was possible. They went over a hill, and Margaret spotted a narrow ditch to the east, too small for a horse, but she might make it on foot. She turned toward it, jumped from the saddle, and slapped Penny's side, sending horse galloping onward as a fake target. With Rose held tightly against her, Margaret scrambled down into the ditch just as Barton reached the hilltop. She pressed herself against the rock wall, Hattie's handgun ready. As Barton paused, looking at the land, after a moment he continued after Penny, believing Margaret was still riding. When he disappeared from view, Margaret allowed herself a moment of relief, before reality set in. They were on foot, miles from anywhere, with limited supplies, and winter coming. The map showed Haven was still at least 100 miles north. As if sensing her sadness, Rose reached up with a tiny hand, grasping Margaret's finger. Those blue eyes, Victoria Harav's eyes, seemed to hold a strong will that made Margaret's own strength. "Return. We'll make it," she promised the baby. Somehow, they spent that day hiding in the ditch, coming out only after nightfall to continue their journey north on foot. Margaret knew Hayes would soon find out about Barton's betrayal and their escape. Their only hope now was to reach Haven before found them 3 days later. Tired and hungry, they stumbled upon an abandoned smoke shack, used by cow herders during summer grazing. Inside, Margaret found Asmal's stove, some forgotten food, and, most precious of all, an old saddle blanket that could be made into a warmer wrap for Rose. As she built a small fire in the stove, Margaret heard the distant sound of horses getting closer. She put out the fire immediately, gathered Rose, and prepared to flee into the night once more. But before she could leave, the door burst open, showing a figure silhouetted against the night sky. A figure wearing a special black hat, the truth revealed. Margaret raised Hattie's handgun, her hand steady despite her tiredness. "Stay back," she warned. The figure remained in the doorway, hands raised slightly. "I'm neither to harm you, Margaret Wilson." The voice wasn't Hayes. It was younger, with a way of speaking she couldn't place. "Step into the light." Slowly, Margaret commanded, keeping the handgun aimed at the stranger's chest. As he moved forward, the moonlight showed a man in his early 30s, with dark hair and a short beard. He wore a long coat similar to Hayes, but no badge was visible. "My name is James Harrive," he said quietly. "I believe you are protecting my daughter." Margaret's grip on the handgun tightened. "Hargrove. You're related to Richard Hargrove, his nephew." "Victoria was my cousin." His eyes moved to the bundle. Margaret's arm. "May I see her?" "Why should I trust you?" Margaret demanded. James sighed heavily. "Because I'm the one who left Rose at your door. I'm the one who drew the map." Margaret lowered the handgun slightly, confusion clear on her face. "Prove it." James reached slowly into his coat pocket and took out his silver necklace, exactly like the one Rose wore. Victoria had two made, one for Rose, one for herself. She gave this one to me before she disappeared. Margaret looked at him carefully. There was a likeness tough woman in the picture, the same striking blue eyes that Rose had inherited. "If you left her with me, why are you here now?" she asked, still suspicious. "Because Hayes is closer than you think," James replied sadly, heckled Hattie Blackwood. Margaret felt as if she'd been hit. "No, I arrived too late to help her, but she told me which way you'd gone before she died. Her last words were that I should tell you she believed in you." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away, needing to stay alert. "Why did you leave Rose with me in the first place? Why not take her to Haven yourself?" James moved to the small window, checking the darkness outside before answering. "Because I was being watched. Richard found out that Victoria had a child who legally stands to inherit everything. Victoria had gathered proof of his crimes, proof that could destroy him. When Shetty stammered, 'You think he had her killed?' Margaret finished. James nodded sadly. "I worked in his company. I found documents proving he'd forged land deeds, bribed officials, even ordered attacks on settlers who refused to sell. Victoria confronted him with this proof. A week later, she vanished, leaving Rose with her masked, trusted servant, who then brought the baby to me. And now Hayes works for Richard, hunting down his own grandchild," Margaret said. "The puzzle pieces finally falling into place. Hayes doesn't know who hired him," James explained. "Richard used other people. He told Hayes he was looking for a kidnapped child. His story is that you stole Rose from her rich family." Margaret finally lowered the handgun completely. "So, you chose me because you had no connections to either the Hargroves or Victoria. You lived isolated enough that Rose could disappear there, at least for a while. And I'd heard about you in town, how you'd built your ranch alone, how you kept to yourself but were always fair in your dealings. I believed you would protect her and Haven." Margaret asked, "Is it real?" James nodded. "It's a settlement founded by people who've escaped men like my uncle. Victoria helped establish it. There are people there waiting for Rose, people who can protect her and the evidence Victoria gathered." A sound outside, the distant crack of a branch, made them both freeze. "We need to move," James whispered. "Hayes has trackers with him who can follow a ghost through a blizzard." Margaret quickly gathered their small supplies, while James checked outside. The night was clear, a half moon giving just enough light to travel by. "There's a mining camp about 10 miles north," James said as they slipped out of the shack. "I have friends there who can provide horses and supplies. If we push through the night, we can reach it by dawn." They set off through the darkness, James leading the way through land that became more and more rough. Margaret carried Rose, who remained thankful and quiet, seemingly understanding the need for silence. As they walked, James explained more about Victoria's work, how she had discovered her father's crimes while looking through company records, how she had secretly gathered proof for years before confronting him. The final piece was a book showing payments to officials and hired guns, James explained. Victoria hid it somewhere before she disappeared. That book, combined with the deeds and contracts she already gathered, could not only destroy Richard legally, but could give back land to dozens of families and tribes who were cheated. And Rose is the key to all of it, Margaret realized, not just as Victoria's heir, but because Victoria must have left some way for Rose to get to the hidden evidence. James nodded. "The locket Victoria told me it contains more than just her photograph." Margaret removed the locket from Rose's neck and looked at it more carefully. The silver case seemed ordinary, but when she pressed the edge in a special way, a hidden space showed itself, containing a tiny key. "That's it," James whispered dexterously. "That's the key to a safety deposit box in Haven's bank. Everything Victoria gathered is there, waiting for the right moment." As dawn approached, they reached a high place overlooking a small mining camp, tucked into a narrow valley. Lights were already visible as miners got ready for their day's work. "We'll be safe there," James assured her. "The foreman, Caleb Wilson, fought alongside me in the war. He hates men like my uncle, who build fortunes on others' suffering." They had just started down the slope when a shot rang out, the bullet hitting the ground at their feet. Margaret turned to see 4 riders cresting the ridge behind them. Hayes and his men, guns raised. "Run," James shouted, pulling a pistol from his coat. "Get to Caleb. Tell him blue skies in December. He'll know what it means." "I won't leave you," Margaret protested. "Rose is all that matters now," James insisted, pushing her toward the mining camp. "Go." As Margaret ran, holding Rose tightly against her chest, more shots echoed across the valley. She heard James return fire. Then a cry of pain that made her heart jump. She didn't look back, focusing only on reaching the camp. on saving the child who had somehow become everything to her. Behind her, the gunfire continued, then suddenly stopped, a silence more terrifying than the shots had been. Margaret reached the first buildings of the mining camp, just as Thiessen broke over the eastern mountains, bathing everything in golden light. Miners came out of their tents and cabins, worried by the gunfire. "I need Caleb Wilson," Margaret cried, her voice break with tiredness and fear. "Please, where is Caleb Wilson?" A tall man with a silver beard stepped forward from the crowd. "I'm Wilson. Who's asking?" Margaret stumbled toward him, her strength finally failing. "James Harriff sent me. He said to tell you Blue Skeeson, December." Wilson's expression changed instantly. He shouted orders to the miners, several of whom grabbed guns and headed toward the ridge where the shooting had occurred. "Get her inside," Wilson commanded, leading Margaret toward the largest cabin. "And someone ride for the doctor in Silver Springs." As they reached the cabin door, Margaret looked back toward the ridge one last time. In the distance, she could see Hayes and his men coming down the slope, dragging something behind them. James had bought them time with his life. Inside Wilson's cabin, Margaret finally allowed herself to collapse into a chair, still holding Rose tightly. "Hayes is coming," she warned. "He won't stop." Wilson nodded sadly. "Let him come. He'll find more than he bargained for in this camp." As miners took up defensive positions around the camp, Margaret looked down at Rose, now awake and staring up with those piercing blue eyes, Victoria's eyes. James's eyes filled with a trust that Margaret swore she would never betray. "We're almost there, little one," she whispered. "Almost home. Haven at last." The battle at the mining camp lasted less than an hour. Hayes had guessed wrong about both the miners' numbers and their strong will. 2 of his men were killed in first exchange of shots, and Hayes himself took a bullet to the shoulder before leaving with his last remaining man. But Margaret knew this wasn't the end. Hayes would return with more men, and possibly with Richard Harroff himself, once he reported finding Rose. "We need to move quickly," Caleb Wilson advised, as he helped Margaret get ready for the final part of their journey. "Haven is 3 days north, if the weather holds." The miners provided fresh horses, supplies, and, most importantly, a group of 6 armed men who would go with them to the border of Haven's land. "James saved my life twice during the war," Wilson explained, as they prepared to leave. "I couldn't save him, but I can sure as hell make sure his sacrifice wasn't for nothing." They rode out at midday, taking a path through the mountains that few knew existed, an old fur trapper's trail that would keep them hidden from the main roads where Hayes might set up traps. The journey was very hard. Early winter storms brought snow and biting winds. Rose developed a cough that scared Margaret, but one of the miners, a former army doctor, helped create a mix of honey and herbs that helped the baby's breathing. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered canyon, Margaret finally allowed herself to think about the future. If they reached Haven, what then? Would she simply hand Rose over to the community and return to her ranch? The thought created an unexpected ache in her chest. "You've grown attached to her," Wilson observed, sitting beside Margaret near the fire. Margaret nodded, watching Rose sleep peacefully in a makeshift cradle. "I never thought I wanted children. After what happened in Philadelphia, I convinced myself I was better off alone, and now, ... Now I can't imagine letting her go." Margaret's voice caught. "But I'm not her family. I have no legal right to her." Wilson looked at her thoughtfully. "Family isn't always about blood, Margaret. Sometimes it's about who stays when everyone else leaves." He paused. "Haven understands that better than most places." The following afternoon, they reached a river marking the unofficial boundary of Haven's territory. Wilson and his men would go no further. "There's a shallow place to cross half a mile downstream," he explained, pointing the way. "Once you cross, follow the river north until you see 3 tall pine trees standing alone on a hill. The town lies in the valley beyond." Margaret hugged each of the miners, thanking them for their protection. To Wilson, she gave Hattie's handgun. She would want someone worthy to have it. Wilson accepted the weapon with serious respect. "Godspeed, Margaret Wilson. May you and Rose find the peace you deserve." The river crossing was dangerous, the water running high with melted snow from the mountains. Margaret's horse nearly lost its footing twice, but they made it safely to the other side as the sun began to set behind the western peaks. As dusk settled over the land, Margaret spotted the 3 pines Wilson had described, standing like guards against the darkening sky. Beyond them, tucked in a protected valley, lights twinkled. "Haven," she urged her tired horse forward. Rose safe in her carrier, both of them exhausted, but so close to their destination. They were halfway down the slope when Margaret heard it. The clear sound of a rifle being loaded. "That's far enough," came a familiar voice that turned her blood to ice. Marshal Hayes stepped from behind a big rock, his right arm in a rough sling, his left holding a rifle aimed directly at Margaret. His remaining man came out of the shadows on the opposite side, blocking any escape route. "You've led me on quite a chase, Miss Wilson," Hayes said, his voice strangely calm. "But at Ensure, hand over the child." Margaret stayed on her horse, one hand protective like of her rose. "She's not yours to take, Hayes. You don't even know who you're really working for." Hayes shrugged. "Don't look care. I get paid either way. Richard Hargrove will kill her," Margaret said desperately. "His own granddaughter." A quick look of surprise crossed Hayes's face, quickly replaced by not caring. "Not my concern. Now the baby, if you please." Margaret looked at her options. She had an apple upon the slope behind her was too steep to ride up quickly. The path to Haven lay ahead, but Hayes would shoot her before she could reach it. Rose stirred against her chest, making a small sound that strengthened Margaret's will. "If you want her," Margaret said, straightening in the saddle, "you'll have to kill me first." Hayes sighed, raising his rifle. "If that's your choice." A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Hayes's rifle. His companion fell to the ground. Hayes spun, firing blindly toward the trees, as more shots erupted from many directions. "Ride," shouted a woman's voice from the darkness. "Ride for Haven." Margaret didn't hesitate. She dug her heels into her horse's sides, galloping down the path as bullets flew around her. Hayes screamed in anger behind her. Then in pain as another shot found its target. The lights of Haven grew closer. Margaret could make out buildings. Now, a church steeple, a water tower, streets laid out in a neat pattern. People were coming out, warned by the gunfire. As she reached the edge of town, several riders galloped past her, heading toward the gunfight. A woman stepped into the road, raising her hand for Margaret to stop. "Margaret Wilson?" the woman asked. She was perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, and the same striking blue eyes as Rose and James. "Yes," Margaret managed, breathless from the ride and the fear. "I'm Elizabeth Harav, Victoria's aunt. We've been waiting for you." Her eyes moved to the bundle against Margaret's chest. "And for Rose." The next hours passed in a blur. Margaret was brought to a comfortable house in the center of town, where Rose was checked by a doctor who said she was healthy despite the journey. Elizabeth explained that Haven had been watching for them since a revving word from Hattie Blackwood. "Weeks earlier, the riders who saved you are our security force," Elizabeth explained, as they sat by the fire. Rose sleeping peacefully in a proper cradle, for the first time in weeks. They patrol our borders constantly. When they spotted Hayes setting up his ambush, they sent word to town, and moved into position. "Ish dead." "No, captured. He'll stand trial for his crimes, including the murder of James and Hattie," Elizabeth explained, her voice hardening. "We have our own justice system here in Haven. It may not be recognized by territorial authorities, but it's fair and final." Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. "And Richard Harav, his day will come," Elizabeth promised. "With the evidence Victoria gathered evidence, we can now get to thanks to the key in Rose Locketwee, can bring down his entire empire. It will take time, but justice will be served." As the night became deeper, Elizabeth showed Margaret to a bedroom with a smaller room next to it, where Rose's cradle had been placed. "These rooms are yours for as long as you wish to stay," Elizabeth said. "Haven welcomes those who need a fresh start." Margaret ran her hand along the smooth wooden rail of the cradle, watching Rose sleep. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. "I've grown to love her as my own, but she has family here, your family." Elizabeth looked at Marguerite thoughtfully. Victoria would have wanted Rose raised by someone who would protect her at all costs, someone who would risk everything for her safety and happiness. She placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "From what I've heard, you've more than proven yourself to be that person. You would allow me to raise her?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. "Allow," Elizabeth smiled. "My dear, I would be honored if you would consider it. Rose needs a mother, not just a protector. And Haven needs strong women like you." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, tears of tiredness, relief, and a joy she hadn't thought possible when she'd first found that bundle on her doorstep. "What about my ranch?" she asked, thinking of the home she'd built. "It can be sold or kept if you prefer. Haven has connections throughout the territories. We can arrange for someone trustworthy to manage it until you decide." That night, Margaret slept deeply for the first time in weeks, knowing that both she and Rose were truly safe. The next days brought a lot of activity. Margaret was introduced to Haven's council, made up of 7 chosen members, who run the settlement. She learned that Haven had been started 15 years earlier by people looking to escape various types of unfair control, former slaves, immigrants running from being treated badly, women escaping harmful situations, and others who simply wanted to live beyond the reach of bad power. Victoria Hargrave had found Haven while looking into her father's land grabs and had become one of its most important helpers, using her family wealth to secretly support the community while gathering proof against her father. Elizabeth told Margaret as they walked through the town one crisp morning. Rose wrapped warmly against the cold. Smart, fearless, and completely dedicated to fairness. She would have been an amazing mother. What happened to her? Margaret asked. James believed Richard had her killed. But did you ever find proof? Elizabeth's face darkened. Not yet. But Hayes might provide that answer. He's talking now, trying to save himself from being hanged. A week after their arrival, news came that changed everything. Hayes had confessed that Richard Hargrave had indeed ordered Victoria's murder after she confronted him with proof of his crimes. Hayes hadn't done the killing himself, but he knew who had, and where Victoria's body had been hidden. We're sending men to check his claims, Elizabeth informed Margaret seriously. If he's telling the truth, we'll finally be able to give Victoria a proper burial and bring her father to justice for murder. That evening, as Margaret sat on the porch of their new home, Rose sleeping in her arms, she thought of both strange journey that had brought them to this place. From living alone on her faraway ranch, to becoming part of a community and a mother. The sound of footsteps getting closer drew her attention. A man she recognized from the town council was walking quickly toward her house, his face showing urgency. Miss Wilson heckled as he approached. You're needed at the council hall. There's been a new development. Margaret quickly gathered Rose and followed him through the darkening streets to Haven's main building. Inside, the council members were gathered around a table where maps and papers were spread out. Elizabeth looked up as Margaret entered. Her face grim. Richard Hargrave has found out where Haven is. Our sources in Denver report he's put together a force of 30 men, former soldiers, and hired fighters, and they're heading this way. When Margaret asked, holding Rose tighter. 3 days, perhaps 4. He's coming for Rose and fourth evidence. The council was divided on how to respond. Some suggested moving most vulnerable residents to safety and getting ready to defend the town. Others suggested leaving Haven temporarily, spreading out to safe houses throughout the territory until the danger passed. What about the evidence? Margaret asked. If we have everything Victoria gathered, why not take it to the territorial authorities now? Because Richard has bought many of those authorities, Elizabeth explained. We need federal help, but the nearest federal marshal is in Denver, and he may also be under Richard's control. An older man with a weather-worn face spoke up. There is a traveling judge in Fort Collins who's known to be honest, Judge Nathaniel Hammond. If we could get evidence to him, he could issue federal orders that even Richard couldn't ignore. Fort Collins is 5 days hard ride, another council member objected. Hargrave's men will be here in 3. Margaret stepped forward, an idea forming. What if we split up? Send the evidence to Judge Hammond with your fastest riders, while another group creates a fake path, making Hargrave believe Rose and the evidence are heading in a different direction entirely. The council members exchanged glances, thinking about the strategy. It could work, Elizabeth said slowly. But who would take such a risk? Whoever leads Hargrave away would be in grave danger. I'll do it, Margaret said, without hesitation. Rose and I have avoided him before. We can do it again. Long enough for your riders to reach the judge. The plan came together quickly. 2 of Haven's most trusted members, former Pony Express riders, would take the evidence to Judge Hammond, traveling light and fast along routes only they knew. Meanwhile, Margaret and Rose, accompanied by 4 of Haven's best fighters, would head west, leaving clear signs of their passage to draw Hargrave away from both Haven and the riders bound for Fort Collins. The town got ready with impressive speed. By dawn, both groups were ready to leave. The evidence ledgers, deeds, contracts, and witness testimonies was sealed in waterproof bags and given to Theodores bound for Fort Collins. As Margaret prepared to get on her horse, Rose secure in an improved carrying sling, Elizabeth approached with a small wooden box. Victoria would want you to have this, she said, opening the box. Tasho, a beautiful silver-handled handgun. It was her father's once. A gift before she found out his true nature. She took it when she left, saying the only justice it would ever serve would be against him, if necessary. Margaret accepted the weapon, feeling its weight and balance. Thank you. I pray I won't need to use it. As do I, Elizabeth replied gently, touching Rose's cheek. Bring her back to us. Margaret, you're both family now. The two groups left at the same time, the evidence riders heading east before they would turn north, toward Fort Collins, while Margaret's group rode west into the mountains, making no attempt to hide their trail. By midday, scouts reported that Herev's force had indeed changed course, following Margaret's group just as planned. The trick was working. For 3 days, they led Harev on a chase through harder and harder land, staying just far enough ahead to avoid fighting directly, while making sure Hare remained focused on their trail. Margaret's knowledge of the wild, combined with the Haven fighters' familiarity with the region, allowed them to keep this delicate balance. On the fourth day, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon, one of their scouts returned with news that changed everything. Harev has split his force. The scout reported breathlessly. 20 men continue to follow us, but he's taken 10 and turned back toward the Fort Collins road. Somehow he's discovered the plan. Margaret's heart sank. The evidence riders had a head start, but if Harev had guessed their destination, he might catch them before they reached Judge Hammond. We need to warn them, she said, already gathering her things, or create another diversion. The leader of their escort, a former cavalry officer named Michael, shook his head. We can't outrun Hargrove's men behind us if we turn back now. They're to close. Margaret looked down at Rose, sleeping peacefully despite the danger around them. Everything Haven's future, fairness for Victoria, Rose's safety depended on that evidence reaching the judge. Then I'll go alone, she decided. You four continue west, keeping Hargrove's main force focused on you. I'll cut through Blackwood Pass with Rose and try to stop Harev before he reaches the Fort Collins road. Michael protested, but Margaret was firm. Ignore these mountains now. Hattie taught me well, and I move faster alone than with a group. Reluctantly, they agreed to a plan. Margaret took the freshest horse, very few supplies, and Victoria's silver-handled handgun. As dawn broke, she hugged each of her companions before riding east toward Blackwood Pass, a dangerous path through the mountains that few knew existed. The pass lived up to its name. Narrow trails wound along sheer cliffs, often barely wide enough for a horse. Twice Margaret had to get off and lead her horse through particularly dangerous sections, Rose safe against her chest. By nightfall, she had crossed the worst of the pass and could see the valley below where the Fort Collins road twisted its way through the foothills. In the distance, she spotted what she had feared, the dust of riders moving fast along the road, heading northeast Harev, hunting the evidence that would destroy him. Margaret pushed on through the night, following a parallel route that would her to cut off the road ahead of Harev's group. Rose remained remarkably quiet, as if sensing the urgency of their journey. As dawn broke on the fifth day, Margaret reached a high ridge overlooking a section of the road that passed through a narrow canyon, perfect place for a surprise attack. Below, she could see the evidence riders approaching, pushing their horses hard. Behind them, perhaps 2 miles back, came Harev's group. McGareth had minutes, not hours, to act. She rode down to the road, meeting the evidence riders just before they entered the canyon. Harev is right behind you, she warned them breathlessly. He'll catch you in the canyon. The lead rider, a young man named Daniel, looked back at the dust cloud approaching. We're still half a day from Fort Collins. We can't outrun them on these tired horses. Margaret made a quick decision. Give meth evidence. I'll take a different route to Fort Collins while you two create a diversion. Make Harev think you still have it. Daniel hesitated only briefly before handing over the waterproof bags. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles north of here, he explained quickly. Judge Hammond is actually there, not in Fort Collins. He's doing private meetings away from prying eyes. Margaret secured the bags and the precious evidence they contained. Go now. Lead Harev away as long as you can. As the riders galloped off, making sure they were seen by Harev's approaching group, Margaret guided her horse into a thick group of trees beside the road, waiting until Harev passed, before coming out and heading north toward the trapper's cabin. She rode hard, pushing her tired horse to its limits. Rose, woken by the shaking, began to cry, a sound that hurt Margaret's heart but couldn't be helped. They needed to reach the judge before Hargrove realized he'd been tricked again. The trapper's cabin appeared, just as Margaret's horse was beginning to slow down. A strong building tucked against a hillside, smoke rising from it. 2 armed men stood guard outside, raising their rifles as Margaret approached. I seek Judge Hammond, sheckled out, raising one hand while holding Rose with the other. I have evidence he needs to see immediately. One of the guards disappeared. Inside the cabin, returning moments later with an elderly man whose serious face was softened somewhat by kind eyes. I'm Hammond, he said, looking at Margaret. Amthy baby. You have evidence for me. Margaret got off her horse carefully, taking the bags from her saddlebags. Evidence of Richard Hargrove's crimes, land theft, bribery, and the murder of his daughter, Victoria Hargrove. He's coming for it, and for his granddaughter. Hammond's eyebrows rose as he looked at Rose. This child is Victoria Hargrove's daughter. Margaret nodded. And Richard Hargrove would see her dead, rather than allow her to inherit what he's built. The judge ushered them inside, where Margaret quickly explained everything. Haven, Victoria's work, James' sacrifice, and their journey. As she spoke, Hammond looked at the evidence, his face growing more and more serious. This is more than enough for federal arrest warrants, he confirmed. Hargrove's empire will crumble when this becomes public. A commotion outside interrupted them shouts and the sound of approaching horses. Hargrove, Margaret whispered, reaching for Victoria's handgun. Hammond moved to the window, looking out carefully. At least 8 riders. My guards are outnumbered. He turned to Margaret, his decision made. There's a cellar beneath this cabin, a hiding place used during the Indian Wars. Take the child there while I deal with Hargrove. He'll kill you to get what he wants, Margaret protested. Hammond smiled sadly. I've faced worse than Richard Hargrove in my time, and he won't dare harm a federal judge in front of witnesses. Now go, protect that child. Margaret reluctantly went down into the cellar, with Rose, listening to the muffled sounds above as Hargrove and his men arrived. She could hear Hammond's strong voice, then Hargrove's angry responses, growing more and more desperate. Suddenly, gunshots erupted, far more than 8 weapons could account for. The battle continued for several minutes. An eerie silence fell. Margaret held Rose protectively, Victoria Shungdung ready, as footsteps approached the cellar door. It swung open, showing not Hargrove but Elizabeth Hargrove, with a dozen Haven fighters on either side. It's over, Margaret, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. Richard is dead. He drew on the judge when he realized he'd lost everything. Margaret climbed Framped cellar, barely believing it was truly finished. Outside, she found Judge Hammond directing the arrest of Hargrove's surviving men. The evidence was being carefully repacked under the supervision of a federal clerk who had come with the judge. Justice will be served, Hammond assured Margaret. The evidence will be presented in federal court. The stolen lands will be returned to their rightful owners, and Richard Hargrove's criminal empire will be Elizabeth approached, her eyes fixed on Rose. Victoria can rest in peace now. Her work is complete. And Rose, Margaret asked, suddenly afraid that now the danger had passed, she might lose the child she had come to love. Elizabeth smiled warmly. Needs her mother, the woman who protected her when no one else could. She took out a document from her coat. Judge Hammond has prepared guardianship papers. If you're willing to sign them, Rose will be legally yours. Tears filled my eyes as she accepted the papers with trembling hands. I never thought I'd find a family again after I left Philadelphia. Certainly never imagined becoming a mother. Sometimes, Elizabeth said softly, the family we choose is more precious than the one we're born to. Victoria understood that. It's why she created Haven, and why she would be grateful that Rose has found her true mother in you. 1 month later, Margaret stood on the porch of her new home in Haven, watching the sunset paint the western mountains gold. Rose, growing stronger every day, babbled happily in her arms. Haven was doing well. With Richard Hargrove's death and his bad actions being revealed, the settlement no longer needed to stay hidden. Judge Hammond had made sure it was recognized legally as a proper town, and new families arrived weekly, drawn by stories of a place where fairness and community mattered more than money or power. Margaret had decided not to return to her ranch. It had been sold. The money used to start a fund for Rose's future, and to help other women seeking new beginnings in Haven. As darkness fell, Margaret carried Rose inside to the warmth of their home. On the fireplace shelf stood 2 silver necklaces, Rose's and the matching one that had belonged to Victoria. Beside them was a framed paper, Rose's guardianship papers, making Margaret Wilson officially Rose's mother. Margaret settled into a rocking chair beside the fire, holding Rose close, as she often did in the quiet evening hours. Your mother was a hero, she whispered to the sleepy child. She fought for what was right, no matter the cost. Someday you'll know her story, all of it. And you'll know that you were loved from the very beginning, by her and by me. Rose's tiny hand curled around Margaret's finger. Those striking blue eyes Victoria's eyes looking up with complete trust before slowly closing in sleep. Outside, snow began to fall gently on Haven, a town built by those who understood that family isn't always about blood, that home isn't always where you begin, and that sometimes the greatest journeys start with a single word: run. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed A Stranger Left a Baby at Her Door and a map with one word: run, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more exciting Western adventures like this one. Your support means everything. Each like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows me to continue bringing these emotional and gripping stories to life. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you loved most about Margaret and Rose's journey. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next frontier tale. Until then, happy trails, and I'll see you in the next video.